Kia ora, I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly. Today on The Detail, in less than 3 weeks, the UK Conservatives could be wiped out.
This election in particular does potentially point to a real Conservative wipeout.
Standing at just 20%, Conservative support is now at its lowest ever in British polling history.
A result that could prove to be fatal for the party that has dominated British politics for 200 years.
Nigel Farage's party is creeping up on the Tories.
Reform UK leader Nigel Farage has declared his party, quote, the opposition to Labour, after an opinion poll showed it had overtaken the Conservatives for the first time.
Seismic for reform.
I think this is the moment where the Conservatives really do pack up, they take the ball and they go home.
3 opinion polls out this weekend painted a grim picture for Rishi Sunak's Conservative Party. One predicted they could end up with just 72 seats in the 650-member House of Commons, the lowest ever in their nearly 200-year history. That poll said Labour would romp in with 456 seats. But the headline grabber was the poll that put Nigel Farage's right-wing net zero migration reform party 1 point ahead of the Conservatives for the first time.
If it is close to a wipeout, then it could be a long while before they rebuild themselves. Because that would take them down to a rump. And indeed, they could well be vulnerable to a takeover, an aggressive, hostile takeover by Nigel Farage's Reform Party.
So how did the Conservatives come to this?
It's getting worse and worse by the day, by the hour at the moment, maybe even by the minute.
Lisette Raymer is Newshub's Europe correspondent in London.
It feels like Rishi Sunak actually cannot do anything right. He has just had another massive gaffe by telling the entire country that he suffered some hardships as a child and he went without Sky television.
What did you go without as a child?
We went out with lots of things.
So what sort of things had to be sacrificed?
Lots of things, right?
Can you give me an example?
All sorts of things. So, like lots of people, there'll be all sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Mm-hmm. But famously, Sky TV.
Okay. Which has, of course, prompted widespread mockery on the streets, on the internet, amongst those campaigning, and it is all being reflected in the polls. The Tories are trailing dismally to the point where I think at the moment we've noticed this week that the Conservatives have actually changed their entire approach with the campaign. And today one of the MPs, ministers, was out there saying that the supermajority for Labour is going to be incredibly dangerous and we need to try and prevent that. So it's almost as if they've already admitted defeat and now they're trying to limit the damage by making sure it's not too much of a landslide. So there is almost a sense of that defeatist attitude coming through now. I think even the Conservatives aren't buying what they're selling.
What is it about Sunak from that day that he went outside of Downing Street and stood in the rain and announced the election date?
Do you regret doing it in the rain, as it were?
I'm not going to deny that it was a bit wet. But
why didn't you have a plan for something inside?
I'm not a fair weather politician, Nick.
It just seems to be blunder after blunder and, an embarrassment for the Tories.
Yeah, I mean, that was a sign of things to come, really, wasn't it? That just complete downpour over his big announcement that just completely overshadowed everything. There was that protest music playing the song Things Can Only Get Better.
Earlier today, I spoke with His Majesty the King to request the dissolution of Parliament. The King has granted this request, and we will have a general election on the 4th of July.
And everybody was just thinking things can only get wetter. It was just a train wreck. And interestingly, they do these polls. Of course, they've got the figures around preferred Prime Minister party in the lead and whatnot, but they also do some quite interesting polling here where they present a bunch of questions and get the voters to answer them that don't seem overly political. But, for example, who's most likely to be prefect, and everyone says Rishi Sunak. Who's most likely to win a Monopoly game, and everyone says Rishi Sunak. And who's most likely to get out of their bed after the first alarm, and everybody says Rishi Sunak. And then on the other hand, Keir Starmer, the opposition leader, is getting the tick when it's all of the questions regarding who makes the best cup of tea, who would you most want to have a conversation with your grandma, who would you most count on to visit you in hospital. So Rishi Sunak to people, I think, just comes across as a massive swot, as a real nerd, as a real money man, whereas Sir Keir Starmer definitely comes across as perhaps a little bit boring, but the more sensitive, the more warm-hearted, the more considerate and compassionate.
And whether you're a family that's been struggling with the cost of living for grindless month after month after month, whether you're a business that's been struggling against the odds for a very, very long time now, or serving your communities, this is for you.
And I think a lot of people at the moment have felt really neglected by the Conservatives, disregarded and forgotten, not just over the last 5 years, but the last 14 years that they've been in the position of power.
You say that you're the one who can deliver stability after all the turmoil, but for many voters, the Conservatives are the turmoil. In this Parliament, we've had 3 Prime Ministers, 5 Chancellors, 5 Home Secretaries, 6 Health Secretaries. How do we know that if you won the general election, you'd still be Prime Minister in a year's time?
Look, I can appreciate people's frustrations. Of course, we haven't got everything right. I don't think any government does, and I know it's been very difficult for many people. But what I can do is work as hard as I can to deliver the stability that I said I would.
So Rishi Sunak, no matter what he says, he cannot get any cut through. And I think, you talk about the gaffes, one of the big ones of the last couple of days, because they're happening that often, was when he left the D-Day commemorations, the 80-year milestone for those veterans who fought in Normandy.
The Prime Minister departed after ceremonies honouring British and Allied troops who died during the Second World War. He left to do an interview in the UK and insists his schedule had been planned far in advance.
Well, with that D-Day blunder, I heard a podcast with 2 spin doctors who say it was the worst political blunder, one of the worst of all time. And in fact, they called it the biggest political fan hitter possibly of all time.
Yeah, such an interesting one, because obviously there's been so much commentary around it, and a lot of, Rishi Sunak came out very quickly and apologised publicly, took it kind of on his shoulders and said, I made the wrong decision, I shouldn't have left.
That was a mistake, and I apologise for that, but I will always be proud of our record in supporting veterans here in the UK.
And that just gave everyone on the campaign trail, including members of his own party, permission to follow that narrative. So the opposition just went so strong on that and said he's made the worst possible decision. Why did he do it? What a terrible move. How disrespectful. Whereas a lot of commentators, a lot of analysts have actually said, he could have spun that so differently. He could have come out and said, look, I was there in Portsmouth on day 1 to meet with the veterans and take part in the services. I was there in Normandy all day, meeting the veterans, paying my respect, taking part in those solemn services, and really doing what those commemorations was all about, which was meeting the veterans and honouring their service and their sacrifice. I didn't need to stay around and meet with all the world leaders and discuss politics. That's politicising an event that shouldn't be about politics. Again, Rishi Sunak just made the wrong decision. It's almost as if he's really bad at politics, is what it feels like.
Let's talk about Sir Keir Starmer. I don't get a sense of him, but as you say, people say he's boring. I guess, does that really matter?
I think this has been one of the worst general election campaigns so far between the 2 main parties I've ever seen in my lifetime. It isn't just that their leaders are dull, very dull in the case of Labour. Sort of Blair without the flair.
That's like exactly what you're saying is the point, is that who gets a sense of him? And that's what a lot of people are asking. They're kind of wondering, who is this guy? He's a bit boring. I don't really know much about him. I don't really know what he stands for. I don't really know what his policies are, but he's better than the Conservatives having another 5 years. So let's just go with that. And I think that's kind of sums up the state of affairs over here at the moment. There is just this real lack of excitement over the future. No one's looking at this election as like, yay, there's going to be this really bright new start and fresh energy and enthusiasm and real optimism for the country. Everyone's just like, let's just get the Conservatives out, and what will be with Labour. There's a real lack of excitement over what is to come, but there's just this overriding sense of we need to get rid of Sunak, we need to get rid of the Conservatives. Enough is enough. We're over it. Everyone is so unimpressed and dissatisfied with politicians across the board.
I just think we're a broken country.
Tories out.
They don't care about homeless, they don't care about immigrants, they don't care.
I don't believe in it, there's never any change. The rich keep getting richer, the poor keep getting poorer.
It's never going to be Conservatives, but is Keir Starmer any better? It's all crap in it, it's all rubbish.
And I think, people have even said that it's not necessarily that Labour will win this election, it's just that the Conservatives will lose it. Tory voters who have always voted for Conservatives just won't be bothered going out and vote anymore because they're so unenthused by it all. And Labour will win that way, which is a pretty depressing outlook for a country, I would say.
And with that in mind, does it really matter? Because there are some big issues. I'm thinking, immigration, cost of living like New Zealand, housing, the broken NHS and taxes as well. That seems to be a big talking point. But are people even taking much notice of the debates around these different issues?
It feels like, honestly, yep, tax has been a huge one.
We have got to cut people's taxes and we have got to alleviate burdens on business. Angela Rayner and the Labour Party, Keir Starmer confirmed this earlier this week, they are going to put up your taxes by £2,000.
That's a lie.
By £2,000 per working household.
So tax has definitely dominated the conversation. But as I say, I feel like at the moment, the headlines are all centred around Rishi Sunak humiliating himself and Keir Starmer just getting through the day. And people are just now in countdown mode. I still think I think the last poll said about 45% of people were undecided. They had a leaning, but they were undecided about where their vote was going. So it just feels like a complete write-off of a campaign. Sir Keir Starmer essentially just needs to get through it because Rishi Sunak is digging his own grave.
I mean, there's a third person in this, and that's Nigel Farage. I've heard him described as a great communicator on the campaign trail, quite the opposite to Sunak. When you think about him, would it be unfair to compare him with someone like Winston Peters? I mean, maybe not so much as extreme politics, but his gift of the gab when he's out there campaigning.
Yeah, I think that actually probably is quite accurate. He's got a real twinkle that can charm people, and he's got a base of supporters who will turn out for him and who will lap that up. And you've got all of these Conservative voters who are feeling just really uninspired by what is happening in their own party. And so they look over there and they see him making these big speeches, big promises, and being very aggressive in terms of his approach trying to steal those Conservative votes. And they're thinking, yeah, maybe it is worth a shot because what we've been doing for the last 14 years hasn't been working.
Send me to Parliament to be a bloody nuisance.
Yes.
But what we need is to reactivate a people's army. A people's army against the establishment. A people's army who want to get this country back on track. A people's army who want to be represented by people who think like they do.
I mean, Nigel Farage he's not out there charming everyone. Absolutely not. I mean, he's had milkshakes thrown at him. He's had all sorts of things hurled his way on the campaign trail. So he's certainly not having a free ride by any stretch of the imagination, but he does manage to grab those headlines with some very, quick-witted comments, although he did, in saying that, really cross the line on the back of that D-Day blunder by Rishi Sunak. He accused Sunak of not understanding, quote unquote, our culture.
You said that he wasn't patriotic, and you said that Rishi Sunak didn't understand our history and our culture. What did you mean by that?
Yeah. Absolutely right. He couldn't make a mistake over D-Day. He should have known in his heart that it was right to be there. I was there. I've been raising money for some weeks to send veterans back to Normandy. The vast majority of people in Britain felt this commemoration was important and the last opportunity to honour the remnants that are still alive. And by the way, I know what your question's leading at. 40% of our contribution in World War I and World War II came from the Commonwealth. He is utterly disconnected by class, by privilege, from how the ordinary folk in this country feel.
Which felt like a real dog whistle to the far right. It felt highly inappropriate and a reference to Rishi Sunak's own ancestry. And a lot of people took immense offence to that comment. He's got that charm, but he definitely can push it too far.
What are the main things he stands for? He's anti-immigration?
Yeah, I mean, the immigration is definitely the leading policy that he would go on. He's really tough on crime, but immigration is definitely a big one, and that's what he was hoping to really take on the Conservatives with, and that is why Rishi Sunak is always talking about how tough on immigration he will be, despite the fact that he himself was an immigrant. His parents immigrated to the UK. He's an example of the benefits of immigration and what people can contribute to a country when they arrive here from offshore. So, but that is, Nigel Farage is huge on shutting down, especially obviously the illegal migrants, stopping the boats, and then, really tough on crime.
So what will Britain be like with Starmer as the leader?
I think that's what, honestly, everybody, this is what I mean, it's kind of a strange thing because nobody's desperately wanting to know that because they just want the Conservatives out. But no, if there is a complaint about Keir Starmer, it's that nobody really knows what his policies are or what he's going to be like. I mean, he's got a lawyer background, so he's very measured. He's supposedly more reasonable, quite sensible, risk adverse. But also there are some serious things that need addressing in this country. You've talked about the housing, the NHS. Obviously, the immigration is always a hot topic. And people want to know what Sir Keir Starmer is going to do about that. He's got 27 big policy items that you can find online, but few people on the streets could actually tell you what they are. And that is why Rishi Sunak is really trying to drill home that there's all these hidden taxes out there in the Labour Party, because Rishi claims that, if you add up those 27 policies, there's such a big hole in the budget there that it's going to end up costing everybody £2,000 over 4 years. So that is what a lot of people are wondering, is what actual change is going to be introduced under Sir Keir Starmer. But there will be huge pressure on the Labour government to do something because so much is broken in this country. But I also think one of the things the public will be looking for is just some stability, some trustworthy leaders, people that they know are speaking the truth, who aren't having parties in the backyard during COVID, who aren't lying to them, who are not getting into constant gaffes like what Rishi Sunak is, who aren't constantly changing leaders, who doesn't have a whole lot of infighting, all these calls for votes votes of no confidence all the time. I mean, the Tories have just been a mess over the last 5 years, and people just want a steady pair of hands. And I think that's why Sir Keir Starmer is doing so well in the polls at the moment, because he is just he comes across, a little bit boring, but that's also quite appealing at the moment.
Interesting that this is going on, that it's more than likely that Britain is going to have a Labour government, a left-wing government, when across the Channel there is such a move towards right-wing politics.
The hard right just won big across Europe, and notably inside the EU's power couple France and Germany. The winds in Europe are definitely blowing rightwards, dominated by mainstream conservatives, with a question around how much they'll work with parties on the harder right.
The right-wing wave that is taking over Europe at the moment is, it's been growing over the last couple of years, but obviously with the European election recently, the conversation around it has ramped up even further. But it is remarkable how it has spread across the continent. It is just completely taking over, and almost with the European Parliament almost taking the Green vote, which is interesting because it kind of shows, we've talked about it a lot recently, how the last European Parliaments, all of the protesting was the children from the climate change protests out on the street protesting against the lack of climate change action. And now the protests that got dominating the streets of Europe are from the farmers protesting all of the climate change regulations and how punitive it is and how they're losing control of their businesses as a result of these crazy or so-called crazy regulations that have been placed on them. And it's that sort of sense now that people are leaning towards, no, actually, we've had enough and we are going to go quite far extreme now and regain some control that we feel we have lost. And that right-wing wave, so many people are leaning towards it now and talking about those policies, that things that were quite extreme once upon a time are almost becoming quite mainstream in the conversation. And that's why they're managing to pick up so many more votes.
Ursula von der Leyen is the president of the European Commission, campaigning for a second term. And she's allied herself with Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, an example of former far-right figures moderating their image to attract the mainstream. When Ms Meloni once openly praised Benito Mussolini, her country's 20th century fascist dictator, she now cites Margaret Thatcher as her muse.
That hasn't translated necessarily to the UK, although obviously there is the threat with Nigel Farage. He does have a credible base of votes coming through, and there are a lot of people concerned that he will really eat into the Conservative vote. Of course, Rishi Sunak is concerned about that, but it hasn't really taken over like it has in Italy, for example, or of course in France with Marine Le Pen. It hasn't taken over to that degree yet. But I think that is purely in the UK because people are so fed up with the Conservatives.
And of course that disgruntlement, that apathy isn't helped by the dreadful weather there at the moment, Lisette.
No, it's very miserable, which does seem to be matching the mood a little bit. I don't want to be too critical, but the Brits do love a moan, and the moaning has been ramped up a lot with the election, and now it's starting out as a very cold summer and things are very grim on the streets. But I think honestly, it will be very interesting as the next weeks play out to see if, one, the sun comes out, but also if people do feel any sort of joy or optimism come election day, come election night, assuming that it goes the way everyone thinks it will. It just seems like this country really is so uninspired and unsupportive of the political system and the people they have elected into the halls of power at the moment. And I hope that whatever the next government does, it reignites some faith in these politicians and what they can actually do for the country.
That's it from The Detail today. We are a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. This episode was engineered by Jeremy Ansell and produced by Alexia Russell and Davina Zimmer. Thanks to Lisette Raymer. I'm Sharon Brett Kelly. Ka kite.